In August 1942, Guadalcanal was a name unknown to most Americans. It wasn't on the radio, it wasn't something everyday folks talked about, and it wasn't supposed to matter. But to a shivering, sleepless group of men in green, crouched behind fallen logs and blackened palms, it became the center of their world. The island's air itself was thick with rot, rain, and gun oil. The cries of tropical birds and night frogs were replaced by artillery and distant shouts in a language most of the U.S. Marines had only heard in war films. But by the end of the month, the battle for this muddy island would turn the tide of the war, and just as important for Allied victory, it would change because of a few pages of paper, an enemy codebook, forgotten in the chaos and blood. Weeks before, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps had loaded up ships at Fiji and Espiritu Santo. The men aboard were scared, resigned, and hungry for action. They were the first Americans trained to land on a hostile beach since 1898. Many were barely 20. Few had more than a year's experience, but their orders were clear: take the airfield and hold it. Most didn't know where Guadalcanal was on a map. They only knew it had an unfinished Japanese runway and that the enemy wasn't expected to give it up without a fight. When the Marines landed on Tulagi and Guadalcanal on August 7, the Japanese defenders retreated deeper into the jungle. But the Japanese Navy had no intention of letting them keep the beach for long. In the days after landing, waves of bombers and Zero fighters pounded the American perimeter. At night, the Tokyo Express, fast destroyers and cruisers, rained shells from the sea. The men were always tired, always dirty, always waiting for the next attack. Most didn't realize that the Japanese, for all their confidence, were being forced to fight in conditions worse than anyone had prepared for. On August 20, after a long, tense night alive with rumors of a big enemy push, Marine sentries near the Tenaru River spotted movement. Their nerves were already stretched thin. Word came down: Japanese troops had crossed the sand spit, moving in heavy numbers. Flares screamed upward. Machine guns rattled from the darkness. The Japanese soldiers, mostly from the Ikiki detachment, trained in the traditions of Bushido, charged through the river mouth and the grass, shouting and firing into the foggy dawn. American lines held, barely at first. Some Marines fell back, but others held their positions, sometimes using bayonets or even fighting hand-to-hand when ammunition ran out. By midday, hundreds of Japanese were killed, nearly wiping out the attacking force. The cost was high for both sides, but the U.S. lines held. In the aftermath, American officers searched dead soldiers for orders, maps, and anything that might help them find out what comes next. Several enemy bodies near the riverbank wore the insignia of naval officers. Carefully tucked in one's pack was an oilskin-wrapped satchel. Inside, alongside photos and dog tags, were strange, carefully written pages of numbers and symbols, columns in tight rows, and a narrow, well-thumbed book. Marines recognized it as some sort of communications manual, but couldn't break the code. They did, however, know it could matter. In a battered metal box, alongside the first reports from the fight, the codebook was shipped to headquarters. When U.S. Navy intelligence at the nearby base received the package, they ran it up their chain of command in a hurry. They quickly realized its importance. This was not just any communication guide. The pages matched the format and language of JN-25, the main Japanese naval code used for strategic and fleet-level signaling. In Pearl Harbor, in rooms filled with wires, chalkboards, and endless sheets of intercepted signals, men and women in uniform labored every day to crack this code. Until now, their results were patchy. Sometimes they could guess the meaning from context. Just as often, they were left in the dark, slow to react to enemy plans. The Guadalcanal Codebook offered a kind of Rosetta Stone. It included pages on how numbers and words were aligned, tables of daily key shifts, and routines used by operators. U.S. Navy cryptanalysts, led by men like Commander Joseph Rochefort and Station Hypo, suddenly had the key that unlocked hundreds of recent messages and would help make sense of thousands to come. With tireless work and growing stacks of interpretable signals, they could now anticipate Japanese fleet movements based on intercepted radio traffic, sometimes within just a few hours of the messages being sent. This sudden leap in intelligence would prove its worth almost immediately. Codebreakers in Pearl Harbor and Washington, equipped with the Guadalcanal documents, unlocked enough of JN-25 to determine both where and when significant Japanese movements were being directed. For the fighting men still slugging it out on Guadalcanal, this translated into real and often immediate changes, more accurate assessments of where and when the enemy might supply their troops or launch attacks, a sharper sense for spotting enemy convoys, and faster, more reliable resupply for U.S. positions. In one notable case, the codebreakers learned of a major Japanese reinforcement convoy, a squadron of fast transports and destroyers intending to land troops and heavy weapons on Guadalcanal. The U.S. Navy scrambled all available planes from Henderson Field, the Cactus Air Force, as well as warships to intercept. The Japanese ships were caught with little warning, several damaged or sunk, and hundreds of reinforcements destined for Tenaru were never landed. Other times, newly deciphered instructions warned of air raids, giving Marines and airmen time to prepare or disperse their assets. None of this was magic. In many ways, it was the result of hard labor, desperation, and luck. But the effect on the war was tangible. The fight for Guadalcanal dragged on into the fall and winter, with terrible casualties and moments of panic for both sides. Skies darkened with dogfights. Sea battles flared through the slot, as Allied and Japanese ships clashed again and again in the narrow waters. At night, exhausted Marines crouched in foxholes, gripping rifles and praying for daylight, while Japanese soldiers crept through the jungle, hoping for one surprise attack to break the American lines. Word of the captured codebook's effect never reached the men on the ground, who only saw the enemy kept at bay, sometimes by narrow margins. But up the chain, American commanders gained new confidence, planning not only to hold Guadalcanal but to push onward across the Pacific. In the months that followed, with the advantage gained by codebreaking, American forces anticipated and countered Japanese offensives at the Battle of Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz Islands, and particularly in the decisive naval engagement at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. These victories, stacking up one after the other, slowly reversed years of Japanese expansion and let the Allies go on the offensive. For the Japanese, the capture of the codebook was a disaster. They had relied on the secrecy of JN-25 since before the war. Though the code was occasionally changed and updated, each revision took time to implement and distribute across a scattered empire. As more code updates fell into American hands, sometimes captured from ships sunk at sea, sometimes found on the bodies of soldiers and sailors or seized in raids, U.S. codebreakers gained an increasingly accurate read of Japanese plans. It is hard to overstate how crucial this advantage became as 1943 began. U.S. submarines and carrier planes, directed by decrypted signals, began finding and sinking Japanese merchant ships at a pace that slowly strangled Japan's supply lines. With less oil, rubber, and iron arriving at Japanese ports, the empire's vast war machines started to grind to a halt. Airfields built at great cost could not operate for lack of aviation fuel. Ships completed at Tokyo's yards waited for months without diesel. The army, dispersed across thousands of islands, found itself short on food, ammunition, and medicine as more and more transports vanished on the long run home. This intelligence also saved lives in small ways. Warnings reached airfields in the Marianas, when Japanese bombers were inbound. Task force commanders altered course or speed to avoid ambush or surprise. Men who might otherwise have been at the wrong place at the wrong time found themselves given another day, another battle, another letter home. The cumulative impact was massive. By the end of 1943, the Japanese Navy, once feared and dominant, struggled to coordinate its scattered squadrons. The U.S., meanwhile, found its confidence growing, its operations marked by better planning and often uncanny anticipation. The unsung story of Guadalcanal's codebook crept into legend among codebreakers and intelligence officers. But for most of the war's veterans, it was simply another part of the slow, grinding struggle to survive every day and night. Marines who had survived that August night on the Tenaru remembered the confusion, the terror, and the grim satisfaction of holding the line. Few ever learned that their muddy, blood-soaked battlefield find had helped commanders 1,000 miles away raid the enemy's mail. Historians after the war would point to Midway as the battle that turned the tide, but in truth, that victory had come with the help of earlier codebreaking, a feat granted in part by a similar lucky capture of code materials. Guadalcanal's codebook, however, worked like a key and a spotlight at the same time, shining light on enemy plans just as the Americans needed it most. Late in the war, as the Allies pressed closer to Japan itself, the intelligence gathered from JN-25 enabled precise target selection for bombers, coordinated submarine and surface attacks on what was left of the Japanese fleet, and helped anticipate plans for kamikaze attacks and last-ditch offensives. The importance of knowing, really knowing, what the enemy intended, where they would move, and how they meant to fight cannot be overstated. It gave U.S. leaders confidence to push faster, farther, and ultimately, to secure victory on terms that might have been years distant without the help of the codebreakers. For the Japanese, the slow, grinding realization that their secrets were not so secret came only after war's end. Some officers blamed spies. Others pointed to lost paperwork, drowned radio operators, or even sabotage. Few accepted that a single mistake, a single lost codebook on a small island far from the home islands, had let the Allies unravel their plans time after time. When the war finally ended in August 1945, and the guns fell silent, stories of code-breaking and secret intelligence remained hidden for years, as military leaders in both the US and Britain believed it could give their nations continued advantage or be needed in some future conflict. Most of the men who had carried bodies off the beaches, who'd fought in the jungle or sweated over cracked radios in stuffy huts, never knew the real story, only that every small act mattered and every battle counted. Years later, as peace returned to the Pacific and old enemies became new trading partners, historians and veterans reflected on what made the difference. For all the bravery, sacrifice, and courage shown by fighting men, sometimes it was the little things that tipped the balance. A mistake by a hurried officer, a lucky find by a tired Marine, a few pages of numbers, and the relentless, dogged work of men and women working with pencils and logic instead of rifles and bombs. It's a story worth telling because behind every headline about a great victory, every chapter written about ships lost or bases taken, there are hundreds of quiet moments where fortune, diligence, and stubborn hope combine to change history. On Guadalcanal, where so many fell and so much was risked for a scrap of land in the middle of the sea, a single codebook helped change the map, not just of the island, but of the whole war that followed. For the families back home, desperate for news, unfamiliar with the terms of cryptography or naval strategy, it mattered only that their sons, brothers, and fathers might be a little safer, a little more prepared, a little more likely to come home. That safety wasn't won by generals or politicians alone, but by every man and woman who worked, struggled, and hoped in the face of darkness. Guadalcanal's victory wasn't just a triumph of arms, but a testament to the power of perseverance and the hidden value of small things. A book, a mind, a bit of luck, woven together by the desperate need to win. In the silent years that followed, when old codebreakers and Marines sat together at reunions, swapped stories, and remembered lost friends, few words were ever wasted on glory. They recalled the heat, the noise, the long hours spent in fear or boredom. They remembered lost papers and muddy close calls. And once in a rare while, someone would mention the codebook, the quiet handoff, and the crazy idea that something so simple could matter so much. They would nod, grateful in the late autumn of life, for every break that came their way, and for one muddy book that helped them turn the tide.